So I said at the end of the last set of notes that you had a case go before the Supreme Court, which was really a pin-headed decision handed down by the Supreme Court called Plessy versus Ferguson. That was the one that set up the so-called separate but equal doctrine that was going to be in place for the next 56 years. Now, as a result, we're moving from that to really talk about what race relations were like at the turn of the century. So we're looking at as the 18th century or the 19th century becomes the 20th century, as the 1800s become the 1900s. We're going to take a look at how things were going, okay? And we talked about some of the different Jim Crow laws and things like that, but that's not the only aspect of life. Remember, I talked about in the North, you also had that de facto segregation that wasn't, exactly in law, but for all intents and purposes. So we're going to look at just the general state of race relations in the United States at that particular time. Now, again, as I have said previously, the whole point of history, in my opinion, is to learn from our mistakes. And so this is one of those sections that I think the more you know about what has gone on in the past, the more you'll be able to not make the same mistakes in the future, hopefully. Now, having spoken about de facto segregation, having said that there were areas of the country in which there was discrimination and segregation going on, even though it wasn't put in place by law, was just considered a fact of life at the time. It was, as I said previously, going to take us until the 1950s into the 60s to actually make improvements on these problems. So what we're going to talk about at this point is that in addition to the laws that were in place, in addition to like the Jim Crow laws and things like that, that were actually on the books, that had actually been passed by a state legislature, for example, there were also customs of the time that restricted the rights of African Americans. Remember, I had said previously that following Reconstruction, the whole idea of many of the new governments in the South was to remind the African Americans living there of, quote, their place, unquote. There were a lot of people who had come back into the governments of these southern states. They had been part of the Confederacy and what have you, and more than one was not pleased with the fact that slavery had ended. The end result of all this was that while there was no slavery anymore, the lives of the black citizens in the South, generally speaking, were not a whole lot better than they had been beforehand. So a number of these different customs were in place to keep people reminded of their essentially second-class nature status within the community. Okay, for example, in everything that happened, regardless of what kind of interaction it was, African Americans always had to make sure they were showing respect to whites, even to the point of kids, even children. Now, when we're talking about that, it's not saying that little kids had to be respectful, to adults. Okay, that's something totally different. What we're talking about here is that if you were an adult, if you were an African American adult, you would still be expected to show some kind of deference, respect, whatever, to a little white kid, regardless of how that kid was behaving or what they were doing and whatnot, because again, it was the concept of making sure that you knew your place, that you understood and remembered that you were not an equal to everybody else. And so this was one of the many customs that just had to be at that time. The reverse was not true. White citizens of the South did not have to show any kind of respect or deference or anything to black citizens in the South. It was only the other way around. So you had to make sure that you were always being respectful. Otherwise, you could have been accused of being, the word was, uppity. Customs often would belittle and humiliate African Americans. And there were a number of different things that you had to do. And some of these, like I said, were, actually written in law, the Jim Crow laws, and others were just the way you had to make sure you behaved. There was no real, slack given in regards to all of this. If it was believed, felt, determined, whatever phrase you would like to use, that you were not showing the proper respect to a white, then you could quite literally end up dead. And that's not an exaggeration. And we're not talking about like you get arrested and get a trial or anything like that. We're getting back to talking about lynching. We're back to talking about you just have an angry mob, grab someone they accuse of a crime, throw a rope over a tree, and you're hanged by the neck until dead. And there was no real recourse for that. Even if you had done absolutely nothing, the individual would still be dead and their family would have no recourse because they didn't have any kind of support or place within the community itself. So the customs that were in place at the time were there, as I said, to make sure that the African Americans were kept, quote, in their place, unquote. For example, think about sidewalks. Blacks had to yield the sidewalks to whites. You had to physically step off the sidewalk. If you're walking down the sidewalk, and there's somebody walking toward you. Generally speaking, everybody kind of moves to their right a little bit, so that way everybody has room to walk down the sidewalk. Well, that wasn't the case in the South in particular. You would go through, if you were an African American walking down the sidewalk and there was a white individual walking towards you, not only did you have to move out of the way, you had to literally step off the sidewalk into the off the curb into the gutter to walk there. You were not allowed to walk on the same street. Now, once they had passed you, you could get back on the sidewalk, but again, this was just being done to remind them that their place was essentially to remember what life had been like under slavery. Yes, you did have more freedoms now. Yes, you were no longer a slave, but at the same time, you were essentially still being treated that way. And while some of this was, like I said, codified in law, a lot of it was just in the hearts and minds of people at the time. And that's what's so hard to break. When you have individuals who feel that this is the proper way to go about doing things, then it's very hard to get that change to happen. Another thing, for example, if you were black, you had to always remove your hat for whites. Okay? It was just the custom. There's no law about that and whatnot. But again, if you did not, you ran the risk of a lynch mob. If you did not, when speaking to a white man, did not remove the hat from your head, and remember, this was a point in time up through the 50s into the 60s, it was still a big thing to wear hats, you could really be taking your life into your own hand just for not removing your hat, just because it was perceived that you did not show sufficient respect to a complete stranger. And it didn't matter who that person was. It didn't matter if they were a good person, lousy person, or anything in between. All that mattered was the color of skin at that point in time, and you had to make sure that you were showing that proper respect. These were the kind of things that were going on that didn't necessarily involve laws, but it was one of the things that people had to be aware of. They had to keep in mind that if they did not do this, then they were really running the risk, of losing their lives. Now, while all this is going on, while all this is happening throughout the South and in different parts of the country, there were those who were trying to figure out what to do, how to go about fixing this. And so African American reformers, I should say reformers, not reforms, my apologies, ladies and gentlemen, African American reformers debated how to address this racial discrimination. Okay, there were a couple of different ways that people were looking at trying to get this fixed. Now, granted, the entirety of Reconstruction was over, so you could not count on the federal government at that point to do anything. In fact, we had seen going all the way to the Supreme Court just gave us Plessy versus Ferguson. So there was a debate amongst African American reformers over what we should do. How do you go about changing the hearts and minds, customs, and laws of a nation like that? Okay, couple of individuals. We've mentioned these names before. First up, got a guy by the name of Booker T. Washington. Okay, now Booker T. Washington made the argument that blacks should not insist on full legal equality, but instead should concentrate on gaining economic power. He was the guy I told you before that really looked at there would get to a point in time where there would be equality between whites and blacks when the white population realized how important the black population was to the nation. Now, Booker T. Washington was willing to be patient. He was willing to go through, this was the guy from the Tuskegee Normal Institute, he was willing to go through, do all this work, train people how to do A, B, C, and D, and eventually we would reach that point. Now, there were those who looked at the ideas of Booker T. Washington and thought this was the best plan. This was a good idea, that you could go through, you would essentially just have to bide your time, you would have to be patient, and eventually things would get better. Now, there are those who are very, very patient by nature. There are those who are impatient by nature. And there are those that in certain situations like this, they might be patient by nature, but they're not willing to wait. It's the idea of what would come up in the Brown versus Board of Education decision: justice delayed is justice denied. And so as a result, while there were those who did believe in Booker T. Washington's theories, there were others who went on a different path. For example, we have W.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells. Okay, they wanted equality immediately. Okay, keep in mind, W.B. Du Bois was the first African American to receive a doctorate from Harvard. Ida B. Wells, remember, she was a journalist and teacher. So their argument is, don't wait. We're not going to sit around. We're not going to patiently just wait until eventually things get better while A, B, C, and D are going on. We're going to go through and we want that equality right away. Both sides have a legitimate argument for why they wanted to do things the way they did. Drawback was, it was still going to take a long time. Even those who demanded and wanted equality right away were going to be disappointed. This would be something that people would continue to work on for years, for decades. And eventually we would start to see progress made. But the problem is, it wasn't something that was going to happen overnight. Despite the fact that there were a lot of people who would have liked to have seen it change overnight, that was unfortunately not going to be the case. Now, for those who wanted to go through and change things much more rapidly, they were willing to take greater risks. Now, when we get into the 60s, you're going to see a number of college students who were willing to take the risk at a lunch counter. It was at a Woolworths. They were unwilling to leave, even though they were prohibited from being served there because they were African American, but they were willing to challenge the law because they saw the law as unjust. And when you do see an injustice like that, there are those who are willing to break the law, to break the rules in order to try and bring about change. And while there were those who were following Booker T. Washington's, more, slow acceptance, there were those that, like we said, wanted immediate change and were willing to break those rules. But the problem is, if you were an African American and you did not follow the customs of the time, you could face severe punishment. Now, remember, for the most part, these customs, they're not laws. Okay, there were the Jim Crow laws that we talked about, but the customs themselves were not necessarily laws. So it's not like you're going to go through and you're not going to step off the sidewalk and get a ticket or something like that from the police. It is very different. If you were seen as not following these rules, then you would be referred to, I said it before, as, quote, uppity, unquote. And that meant that you faced some serious consequences. You could be punished in the extreme. More often than not, that extreme punishment meant lynching. Now remember, we talked about lynching before. Ida B. Wells spoke against this. Lynching means that you've done something in the eyes of a mob. Now, it may or may not be true. You may have done something. It may have been a crime. You may have committed a murder or rape or something like that, and the mob is after you. Or it may just be someone says you did something, and the mob is after you. Or it may just be you didn't step off the sidewalk, and now the mob is after you. So you think about it. You are now at the mercy of a mob. There is no law and order. There is no one there to protect you and your rights. There's no one there to make sure that if you're accused of a crime, that you get a trial and a jury and things like that. Instead, all you're going to get is a rope around the neck, and you're going to be hanging from the tree until dead. This was not uncommon, ladies and gentlemen. You would be hanged without a trial. The mob would be judge, jury, and executioner. They would decide you had done A, and therefore the sentence was death. And like I said, it might be for an actual crime. They may have thought you did, fill in the blank. But it could have just been that you weren't showing proper respect. And if that happened, there was no recourse. If that was you that got hanged, there was nothing you could do. You were dead. There was nothing your family could do. There was no recourse for them either. It was unfortunately considered just the way things were. And there were those who were willing to break the rules, trying to move forward. But by doing so, they took their lives into their own hands. The concept of lynching is one of the more horrific things that I can come up with for what's referred to as mob justice. As I said before, ladies and gentlemen, it is incredibly important to learn our history. You have to know what has happened in the past to make sure you learn from those mistakes. It is the responsibility of every generation to know what happened beforehand to make sure that it doesn't happen again. And unless we learn history, warts and all, we're never going to be able to make sure we don't make that mistake again. Now, as I said, predominantly things like this were happening in the South. And the South is where you had the Jim Crow laws. But if you were an African American who had moved north, you'd been a sharecropper in the South and you decided that was it, I'm getting out of here, I'm going north where things are better, the drawback is there you also face discrimination. And while the North didn't have Jim Crow laws, they didn't have that de jure segregation, they did have, as I told you before, de facto segregation. De facto segregation was segregation by fact. There was no law whatsoever, but it was just, quote, the way it was, unquote. For example, if you had moved to the North, you found that you were living in a segregated neighborhood. Now, this was sometimes referred to as redlining, where they would go through and there would be a line through the town that on one side is where whites could buy and rent property, and on the other side was where African Americans could buy and rent property. And the realtors and the people who were in business all knew to whom they were supposed to rent and to whom they were not supposed to rent. So you may have left a sharecropping life in the South somewhere coming north, but you're still finding out that you're not allowed to do whatever you want. You're not allowed to live wherever you decide to live. That there are rules in place, though unspoken in this case, as to where you can live, what you can do, and how you can behave. So you moved north for things to get better, and maybe they were financially, but maybe they weren't as good as you had hoped. Another area in which you might face some form of discrimination in the North would be in the workplace. Now, again, we're not talking about there being some kind of rule, that there being some kind of law handed down by the state government or anything along those lines. What we're talking about here, again, is the unwritten de facto segregation. Henry Ford is famous for paying both his white and black workers, when they were making the Model Ts, the same wage. But within the factory itself, things were a little bit different. It would be something as simple as a coat hanger, a hook upon which to hang one's coat. There were some reserved for whites and some were for blacks, and it just depended. And some of the different jobs were reserved for whites or blacks. Yes, you were still getting paid, a decent wage, but at the same time, maybe you weren't getting the job that you really were qualified for. And again, no rules were in place at this time. There was no kind of law stating that this is the way things were. It was just the way it was, unfortunately. So you faced discrimination in where you got to live. You faced discrimination in your workplace. And sometimes all this discrimination turned violent. In Chicago, turn of the century, there were 4 young men who were swimming in Lake Michigan. They found a piece of wood or something. They were climbing up on that, jumping off, diving into the water, basically just messing around, having fun, not doing anything. And there's a white guy on the beach, starts throwing rocks at him. Now, at first, they thought it was a joke. They thought it was funny and whatnot. So he'd throw a rock and they'd dive out of the way and whatnot. Until finally, one of the rocks connected with one of the guy's heads. And it ends up killing him. Now, a fight is about to ensue. A police officer arrives, but does not arrest the white guy who started everything. And this led to violence in the city of Chicago. You got to understand, it reaches a particular boiling point. When you put together a great number of different issues all at once, you're going to see eventually an explosion of some kind. And in this case, you weren't going to see a lot of explosions of any kind of violence in the South, but you would see it more in the North. Again, ladies and gentlemen, like I said, we have to learn our history. You have to know what has happened in the past to know how to fix the future. Have we been a perfect society? Absolutely not. Are we making progress? I would definitely say so. So as a result, we need to look back at what has happened in the past. We need to learn not just from our own personal mistakes, as I said, but from the mistakes of society and from history as a whole. That is the only way any kind of society can actually move forward. The problems that were going on at the turn of the last century, those were issues that needed to be addressed. And we'll talk about how they were addressed later on.